Okay, now let's think about some of the dyeing I've been doing lately. Not the ice dyeing, because we did that last weekend. This has been straight up kettle or tray dyeing. And for these particular dye projects, uh, two of them are handspun yarn. This is one of the handspun yarns, and the other one's a commercial yarn. For all of them, I had put together a short list of projects that I wanted to knit out of this yarn when it was dyed. So this was yarn that had been sitting in my dye studio for forever waiting to have something done to it. So this merino tencel started off as an undyed handspun yarn. The first time I dyed it, I mixed together a whole bunch of leftover magenta color dye stock that I had lying around. It was like super old, like 3 years old. And I was not sure what was going to happen because commercial dyeing experts like Felicia Lowe say dye stock will usually last about 6 months. What I've discovered is what happens with the dye stock that's older than 6 months is it can come unmixed. So that's an easy fix. You just mix it up some more before you pour it into your dye pot. Or it won't exhaust. And that's an easy fix. You just add more of your acid. In this case, I use powdered citric acid for my dyeing because I no longer like it when my clothes smell like vinegar. And citric acid is actually really inexpensive and much easier to store, in my humble opinion. So, first I did a crazy magenta bath, and it was beautiful. But I had tied some of my ties too tightly, and or I hadn't mixed around the yarn in the dye pot, and so there were some white spots, and that was unacceptable. So then I let's see if I can remember how I did this. See, this is why you have to keep notes. Then I laid it in my oven tray that I reserve especially for dyeing. It's the one I use for big ice dyeing projects. I laid it in the tray and I poured some purple, and I specifically laid it out so that the bare spots on the first dye job were more visible. And I poured over some purple, and that purple came out so super blotchy. I wasn't happy with that either. So then I did a third batch back in the dye pot with more magenta, but I miscalculated. I did such a light depth of shade, you couldn't even tell that I had overdyed it. Because the thing with overdying is once you reach a certain value, a certain darkness, you can really only kind of edge toward really dark. You can't get light. You can't dye something lighter unless you're willing to use a dye remover, which I was not because I feel that that's usually pretty damaging to the fibers. So last weekend I did another kettle batch, and I added enough magenta to kind of smooth out these differences. So I believe that what's going to happen when I start knitting this is I will get kind of this kind of moody effect where the magenta shades into more of a pure purple, and I think it's going to be okay. I'm going to knit a swatch first, but I think it's going to be okay. And in fact, when I made my short list of projects for this yarn, I made notes about how much color variation each knitting pattern could handle. Because some knitting patterns, the ones that are about the colors in the yarn or color in the yarn, some knitting projects can handle more variety in the color of a yarn like this. I'm not talking Fair Isle necessarily, although you can actually do. If I ultimately decide, oh, I just want to, or I have one skein left over, I could actually do a really cool circular yoke sweater using one skein of this for the accent colors around the neck, and the change in colors will make it look like I used more yarns than I actually used. But I think that because I deliberately chose sweaters with simpler lines, less, so they don't have any cables. At most, things with welts, which are the ridges you make by knitting 3 rows and then purling 3 rows, welts work beautifully with stuff like this. Or slip stitch patterns. Uh, the garment I'm working on right now has got these uh, slip stitches, columns of slip stitches that just make a little bit of surface interest. But I would never, for instance, try a cabled pattern or a lace pattern with yarn that is this varied, because you wouldn't even see the cables. The color's going to take over. That's just the nature of the beast. So that is my magenta experiment with my merino tencel. Oh, and by the way, I just discovered another cool idea the next time I want to dye a highly variegated batch of yarn. So I grabbed one of these reusable zip ties to clasp all my skeins together, and it occurred to me that if I took this great big bundle of yarn and twisted these, I think there are 4 or 5 different skeins, into a super twist, I could do some amazing things, making dyeing a really variegated colorway, because the dyes wouldn't necessarily penetrate all the way to the interior thing. So more happy accidents. And this is something to note about this Lemonade from Lemon series. Sometimes what you think is a disaster actually leads you to the most creative solutions that you might never have thought of otherwise. So this is part, to me, this is part of the fun of doing all this stuff. And then taking the time, like I said, to evaluate the the project or the steps in the project afterwards, just to see what that gets you. All right, this is the commercial yarn. This is Knit Picks Bear that they sell in these great big hanks that are already um, are kept in skeins. They're not rolled into balls, so you don't have to do anything to them. The one thing you have to do to them is add more skein ties, because the first time I tried dyeing one of their skeins, it hadn't been tied enough, and I ended up trying to undo a plate full of cooked spaghetti afterwards. So again, the color I wanted to get was really, really light, and I think that I miscalculated and mixed up the dye about 10 times stronger than I meant to. So when I thought I was doing 0.125% depth of shade, I was actually doing more like 12% or something like that. Math mystifies me. So, so in fact, this very, very pale color here was what I was aiming for. And you can see that that's not what happened. So my corrective was, again, to try dunking this, putting this into another pot with a much darker blue and hoping for a moodier kind of appearance like on the merino tencel. And that didn't work. And I'm still not sure why. But the upshot of it is, I do not want to try to knit with this yarn, or I don't want to try to make my intended project with this yarn, because there is too much difference, not in the hue, the blues and the turquoises in here, but in the value. So it shades from very pale and muted to very dark and bright. And the particular project I have in mind, this just isn't going to work. So how do you recover from this? One solution is, honestly, at this point, to just make it black. Just dye the whole thing black. And dyeing it black you will still, especially if I don't go black, but I mix up a dye bath that is, let's say, 1% depth of shade, it'll even out these colors. Uh, it'll all be black, but you'll have a really complex color, because the colors will be in layers on this. So this one goes back into the dye studio for another plan. Then finally, I've got my last batch of hand spun yarn. And this is an alpaca yarn that oh my gosh, I spun this 10 years ago and it's been sitting undyed, waiting for something to happen to it. Um, and now, because I didn't take notes, um, I think that what I did was I laid this in my roasting, my dyeing in the oven pan and poured on some blues and some greens. And then I just cooked it in the oven at a very low temp for an hour and a half until the dye exhausted. This one I'm going to call a keeper. Um, Again, based on nothing else than the short list of knitting projects I had in mind when I chose these colors. So when I'm looking at knitting projects, potential knitting projects, let's say on Ravelry, uh, I then make, like I said, I make a short list and I make notes about how dark the color should be and how much contrast, how busy the yarn color can be before I head into the dye studio. And the ones I have in mind for this particular batch of yarn, I think I can make work. And again, I'll get this lovely shading, this subtle, this is actually pretty subtle color changes within the fabric that add some colorful interest to a very plain garment. So this has been my Lemonade from Lemon series, and I hope it gave you some fun ideas.